Hi, everybody. Thanks, Anthony and Cara, for the introduction. And thanks very much for the chance to speak today. I'm just going to hopefully pull up the slides, and then we can start from there. Here we go. So it's going to be a very whistle-stop 10-minute tour of us and some of the questions posed around our work and the relevance of the session today. So I'm just going to start very, very briefly for a minute or so, just introducing us as an organisation. So Trees for Cities, we're a national charity. We're established in 1993. Originally as Trees for London, but now we work very much across the whole of the UK and have some international projects. So we have projects in most of the towns and cities at some points over recent years that you'd probably think of or live in. Over that period, we planted over 1 million urban trees. Many of those have been large standard trees in parks, estates, woodlands, schools, etc. And we also more and more these days do quite a lot of other woodland creation projects. Is obviously that's a place where we are planting large volumes of trees as well. Our model is that we work with local authorities. We're not a landowning organisation. We work alongside local authorities on local authority land, and very much work deeply with people, with local communities, and with volunteers to deliver, to plan, to deliver, and maintain the projects that we're working on. And we plant trees for a very wide range of benefits and impacts. As we're finding out more and more these days, that the very wide benefits that trees have to us in an urban environment. So whether it's related to ecosystem services like cooling and shade, obviously relating to climate change adaptation, carbon capture, mitigating localized air pollution, reducing noise pollution, all of the various health and well-being benefits that come with improved trees and green spaces, particularly that we've seen over recent months, over the COVID pandemic, how vital green spaces have been to our health and well-being and will be looking forwards. And of course, not to lose sight of, amongst all of the more sort of perhaps technical and scientific benefits of trees and green spaces, the benefits they bring in terms of the aesthetics and the cultural values, which I think for many people are actually the reason why they want trees outside of their houses or in their gardens, or high quality green spaces. It's what brings, improves our life in a slightly softer sense. So, sorry, just trying to move through to my next slide. Apologies, it doesn't seem to be going.
You might need to click in the bottom left-hand corner of the slide on your screen.
Right. Let me try that. Okay. So the question poses, what barriers do we need to overcome in order to improve our urban forest, to plant more trees and protect the trees we've got? And in truth, there are many barriers that we're facing in this space. Probably the big one, really the obvious one from an urban perspective, is around land availability. Naturally, trees are competing with many other demands for the land in our urban spaces, whether it's roads, housing, buildings, etc. And that really links into the point around development. Our cities are obviously ever developing entities. They never stand still. And so we can't take for granted what's there at the moment. And we always need to be thinking ahead of what we can plant and how we can protect the existing tree stock. The pressures of development are huge, where we're receiving ever more, or the authorities are receiving ever more demands and requests for felling licenses, for example, in cities. And we're seeing ever more illegal felling as well. So there are real pressures on trees being removed at the moment. The third barrier I put there is around maintenance costs. So there's a lot of the funding goes towards the planting of trees, but actually what perhaps doesn't get as much attention is the maintenance of trees. To make them healthy and successful and lasting, they need to be maintained well. And if that's not the case, they will probably either die or they'll be removed. And it's very difficult often to convince funders and donors and authorities to put adequate budgets together for maintenance costs. That then leads into the next point, really around general budgets. Budgets have been squeezed, as we know, in many areas, in many walks of life, and look like they're going to continue to be squeezed even further over the coming year or two, particularly. And green budgets are often the ones that are, as you're probably aware, are the ones which are very susceptible and get cut often first. And we've seen significant cuts to local authority budgets, to central government budgets in certain areas, and other funding sources as well. So that has naturally resulted in a significant pressure on what we can achieve and what local authorities can achieve. The final point there around barriers is around quantity versus quality. There's a lot of pressure at the moment to be planting lots of trees. You probably hear lots in the media about the UK increasing its tree number, which is great, and that's definitely pushing the agenda forward. But there is a risk that if we just simply focus on the number of trees and the increase in canopy cover, that will lead to planting in the wrong places, planting the wrong trees, planting incorrectly, etc. We have to also make sure that the work is delivered, quality work is delivered. The other sort of perverse incentive that gets created through this is that people want to be able to count the number of trees, and that often leads to a preference for, say, woodland creation projects where you're planting, thousands of small trees, saplings en masse in spaces, which are great and are needed very much so, even in the urban context. But actually, trying to persuade people to find the budgets for larger trees on streets or in parks and housing estates that have a very, very different costing model, much more expensive, can be a real challenge. So that pressure on tree numbers is certainly a barrier that we need to be aware of. Okay, next slide. So how can it be made easier to do what we're doing? So, in terms of our work is not just about planting, but it's trying to influence people, authorities, etc., to do more of what we're doing. And some of the areas that we focus on. So we want there to be a wider appreciation of the asset value of trees. Trees are often still seen as a liability, as a cost. That they cost to plant, they cost to maintain, and they can have some disbenefits around issues that they might have, for example, to pavements or roads or structures. But actually, there's many calculation tools these days that show the asset value of trees in terms of their ecosystem service benefits, natural capital service benefits, and actually usually when you put the two together, the asset value of the trees outweigh the liability aspects, and that's how we want them to be seen going forward. And linked to that, really, for trees, urban trees, to be seen as part of the critical infrastructure alongside roads, buildings, other physical infrastructure within the towns and cities. Actually, trees and green spaces, green infrastructure needs to be seen on par and planned and thought about in the same light as those other aspects of infrastructure are considered. And again, that comes back to the question of budgets. Budgets need to be set for green infrastructure that are realistic, that aren't always a sort of tag on to other programs. And they need to be planned for, maintained, and there needs to be adequate budget in a number of areas to make that happen. In order, again, to sort of to strengthen that, ensuring that green infrastructure and trees are fundamental in local plans and in planning strategies is really going to help underpin that process of getting trees and green spaces up the agenda and seen, in the importance they need to be seen in. And tree and woodland strategies are a core part of that. That's a more granular level that generally sits below local plans. But actually, many local authorities at the moment don't have tree and woodland strategies. I think only around 50% have a strategy in place. And of those strategies, many of them aren't particularly, they're not perhaps as good as they could be. So there's quite a lot of work to do in helping local authorities, organisations like ourselves and central government and others to know what a good tree and woodland strategy looks like, particularly, again, as resources are being squeezed and the numbers of tree officers and related individuals who are there to develop these sort of strategies are being reduced constantly across many local authorities. And then largely and it sort of links to all of these, but really to see felling of trees as a last resort, as a principle that runs through planning, runs through strategies. Trees should only be removed when you really, really have to. And there are times where trees have to be removed, absolutely. We would never argue against some trees being removed, but still too often it's seen as something that is too easy to do or the first step to do, when actually it should be seen as the last thing we should be thinking about doing. Okay. So what are the potential benefits for the economy, jobs and skills for rolling out the urban forest more widely across our towns and cities? Well, there are so many, and I've just touched upon a few here. There's a massive opportunity to boost the green job sector. As we're all aware, as the portfolio of jobs is shifting over as we look into future years, and AI is planned to be replacing many of the jobs of today. There's a huge opportunity for green jobs to step in, jobs that can't be done in a machine way, for example. And we're desperate for more people to be picking up some of the green jobs that we're talking about. We find as an organization there's a dearth of specialists in this field. Very easy to find people coming in at a lower level, a more junior level, who are keen and enthusiastic to learn, but actually finding the right people with deep skills and deep experience is something that where there is a definite gap. And so providing the training and the career structures to allow people to work through the industry and become real experts could be not only create jobs, but be a massive benefit to our green infrastructure as we look forward. And there are many, many, many economic benefits to trees and green spaces, and probably teaching people to suck eggs on this one. But we know this now. It's, there's been huge amounts of research done, evidence gathered about the economic benefits, and just some of them, for example, the health savings that we get from green spaces and people using green spaces, in terms of things like the reduction in mental health issues, physical health issues around obesity, diabetes, certain forms of cancer, and all of the benefits that come with taking greater exercise, accessing green spaces more, connecting to nature, etc. There is a huge bank of evidence out there. So, there's a projection that for every £1 spent on an urban tree, that creates £7 worth of economic benefit back to us. So it should be a no-brainer. There's plenty of evidence as well around the impact on house prices, for example. So the street trees are creating a huge benefit to our house prices, and there's a perverse situation there that we can actually lead to gentrification of areas if you end up greening previously sort of less wealthy areas. But that's something that we take into consideration as we're looking at our work as well. But there are plenty of economic benefits there, and then plenty of benefits relating to, as touched upon, climate change adaptation. So flood risk reduction is an obvious one, and something that many of our towns and cities are suffering from badly at the moment, or have a huge risk from. And trees are playing a significant role in preventing the rainfall reaching the hard surfaces or slowing it down, obviously absorbing rain through leaf structures and off the leaf, and through root structures and from the leaves. So having a significant benefit there. And also to many of the other impacts that we're seeing around climate change, whether it's helping to alleviate the urban heat island effect, obviously as a carbon sink themselves, lowering air pollution costs when we're looking at air pollution as well, which is another of the major issues in the urban context. So many, many, many benefits there that we can talk about trees and green spaces. And then lastly, coming on to some of the other unexpected or expected co-benefits of trees and green spaces, touched there upon the huge potential public health outcomes, and that really is an area that perhaps is getting some of the most focus at the moment, and to the point where we're now looking at green prescribing. Doctors, GPs are actually asking people to go outside, spend time outdoors as part of their recovery and prevention. The evidence there, as I say, is enormous. The opportunities for outdoor learning and education, again, an obvious one, but it's in a time when children are ever more disconnected from nature and spending less and less time outside. And again, there's plenty of evidence to demonstrate that. Planting trees, providing opportunities to communities, particularly those that come from places where there's historically less or lower quality green space, which overlap often with the areas of most social deprivation. Providing opportunities for children to come out and plant trees and get involved in nature can have enormous benefits, lifelong benefits to their health, to their well-being, their education. Many of the indicators at schools demonstrate that actually outdoor learning can have many, many positive benefits on children. Thirdly, there around community cohesion and ownership. Our work, as I say, is deeply focused in communities and with volunteers, and the bringing people together within communities can have enormous benefits within those communities, and people get to meet each other, spend time, and particularly at the moment where in periods of lockdown, for example, and the pressures that we're feeling in lockdown, and our communities are being strained, and actually activities that can bring people together and get people outside and then actually create their own spaces, take a real lead in creating their own spaces, can have enormous positive impacts on communities, on individuals. And then lastly, just a very general point around the quality of life of trees, relating to trees and green spaces. They form a fundamental part of our psyche, and we can't really live without them. We don't often appreciate them as much. We walk past them on the street without perhaps sort of recognizing the benefits that they have to our psyche and the aesthetic values that they're having, how much they're helping to green the hard landscape and the grey. And I think that's a benefit there that we really need to keep in mind and not lose track of. And I think that's probably more or less my 10 minutes up. So I think it was time for questions after that.
Yeah, great. Thanks very much, David. Cara, would you like to ask a first question of David?
Yeah, so the first question from Cara Naden, and I think you touched on this a little bit. So I have a question about trees. I have experienced issues with homeowners, building owners wanting to cut down trees because insurers see trees near homes as detrimental to the property. What can we all do to reverse this trend? And I suppose I'd like to ask just a related question, which is there enough thought in planning now to make sure trees aren't planted too closely to new homes, so that we don't have this situation 15 years down the line?
Yeah, it's a real problem. I mean, we tend to focus on the public space, but actually, a huge percentage of our trees obviously are in private spaces, and there's very little actual formal protection for most of those. If you live in conservation zones, or if your tree happens to have a tree protection order, then it's different. But generally speaking, if somebody owns a tree in their back garden, somebody else has very little control over what they can do with that tree. And when there is a huge amount of loss happening in people's front and back gardens, that is difficult to record, and it's probably resulting in a large percentage of the canopy cover loss that we see. There is, local plans often don't touch upon this. Again, it's focused more on public space, and there are reasons for that. So there are, we are looking at and thinking about mechanisms to strengthen protection on private land, but it is difficult. Combined with things like people converting their front gardens to driveways and using sort of plastic grasses, etc. All of that combined with reducing the amount of green space we have in the private sphere. It is a real problem. It is a real problem. And at the moment, we don't have the answer to that, but you're absolutely right to identify. And the insurance industry doesn't often help, sadly, although there is a lot of work going into working with the insurance industry now to try to strengthen those protections, make them understand actually when a tree is a problem, when it's not a problem. And often a tree is removed more as a preventative measure, actually, when it could be retained. There are other options to do some physical work at a relatively low cost that would help to save those trees. So there are some positives there, that the sector is working closely with the insurance sector to try to create better practices in that respect. In terms of the question around sort of planning, yes, I think again we're getting better and better at understanding what trees to put where, what are the right trees for the right places. Developers are, there's a lot of information available to developers now thinking about that. There's improvements in tree pits, so that actually tree pits now can be created so that they will reduce the risk of impacts to local physical infrastructure. So there is a lot of work going into that, but not to say that there is a long way to go, and often you still do see the wrong tree planted in the wrong place, which will ultimately mean that tree probably gets removed at some point in the near future, as you say. So we're moving forward, but plenty of work to do.
Great, thanks, David. Could you point people to anything publicly available on valuation methodology? Somebody's asking.
So there are various methodologies. There's one that's used fairly widely called CAVAT, CAVAT, and if people Google CAVAT, I'm sure you can find information about it and understand how the tool is working. It's quite a complicated tool, in the sense, well, not complicated, but it needs to be, there's a number of factors that need to be plugged in to actually create the value of an individual tree. That's done more on an individual tree basis. There's another tool that's now being heavily used called iTree. And iTree is used more on a population of tree basis. So that's looking at the canopy cover of, say, a region, a city, even down to sort of community level, and it using a sort of sampling system, understanding what the numbers and type of trees are, and then that those numbers get plugged into the system, and then you can calculate from that the economic value and benefit of those trees in relation to carbon capture, in relation to air quality, and various other aspects of the tool as well. So that's one that's being used widely. Many towns and cities are now doing iTree studies of their entire towns and cities. We've done one in London a few years ago, and they're happening across many other towns and cities. And that's a great tool to be able to compare comparative levels of benefits and canopy cover, etc., across different spaces, urban spaces.
Great, thanks, David. We might have to ask you if you would mind answering some of the questions remotely afterwards, and we can post those to people by email. Sure. But just very, very quickly, can you explain what a tree pit is, please?
Oh, sorry, I should be careful of the it just means where the tree goes into, the hole that the tree is dug into, and it's most applicable when obviously you're thinking about a hard surface, and when you're going down in a street, for example, there's a lot going on underground, just as much going on underground as there is above ground in terms of underground services. So creating a good pit for the tree, which is taking into consideration all of the stuff that's going on, the services underground is very important, and the soil quality as well that the tree is going into. So tree pits in themselves it's a specialism that can't be taken for granted. It needs to be thought through very carefully, and lots of survey work needs to be done to understand where you can put a tree successfully for the future.
Great.